what does it mean to live in this world and to flourish as human beings?
So, my first question for you is, across disciplines, ethics means different things to different scholars. What is ethics to you?
Oh, wow. So for me, ethics, as a philosopher, I guess most philosophers might answer that in terms of a fairly theoretical approach. So in many cases, that means ethics is a theoretical structure that guides directs action, gives us justification for actions in the social world. For me, I actually always avoided ethics when I was a grad student. And the reason was that the way it was presented was as this fairly arid and kind of this sort of pursuit that ended up being at the kind of level of theory, but didn't actually deal with people in the real world. And so for me, ethics has to come with questions around morality. I know those are not those two words are not the same thing, but if an ethics isn't livable, isn't something that can be lived in a real world, if it's simply about, for example, maximizing utility, maximizing happiness for the greatest number or something like that, that still doesn't get to the question of what does it mean to live in this world and to flourish as human beings. And so for me, it really has to come down to that very much lived sort of thing. If otherwise it's I would say not. It's ethics, sure, but it's not that interesting. So for me, ethics has to have a payoff.
For you, you study multiple different topics within philosophy. You have a lot of different interests. So,
Right.
what pushed you to study such a wide variety of different topics within philosophy?
I think a certain amount of dissatisfaction with, when I was coming through as a grad student with what philosophy was able to actually engage. My graduate work was at University of Waterloo in Canada. It's a very strong school for things like computing, for engineering, for a lot of technical areas like that. And I ended up hanging out with a lot of those people and realizing that we often wanted the same world, but we had an entirely different vocabulary and a different set of tools to try and get there. And so I became fascinated with things like technology, things like the environment. The questions that I guess in the end are ethical questions, but that philosophy at the time, at least, had really not made much headway on addressing. And so that kind of drove me, as a philosopher, to investigate a wide range of different things, and that could be clustered around questions of place. I'm very interested in the ways that we experience place, that we build place, that we lose it, that we yearn for it, that we memorialize it, that we do all of those sorts of things. And that, among other things, is an ethical space, it seems to me. And so, a lot of my diversity as a philosopher is tied together by that kind of core interest in place.
Right. So, you touched on it a little bit, but could you tell me a little bit more about the connections of ethics to your work specifically?
Sure. So if you take the notion of place seriously, what that means is you are living with other flesh and blood human beings. You are living with nature. You are living in cultures. You are living in ways that I think, as philosophers have often tried to simply think about how do we live well with others in such a manner as to not get in their way unduly. So it's been kind of a negative ethics, I suppose. In other words, the ethical principles have tended to come, to cluster around, do no harm kinds of questions. I'm much more interested in questions about flourishing, about what it means to live well as a human and to live well in this world, what it means to create a world in which the natural world flourishes as well, which cultures flourish, all of these things. And I think, for me as a human being, I don't flourish and I can't flourish unless those other things are also happening. And so for me, that's a very, at its core, an ethical question, right? How is it possible to build that kind of world? So in other words, it's not the kind of ethics that you might learn in a kind of intro ethics course. Here's all the theories, and here's how you make decisions. Kind of the last minute. Do you kill Hitler or don't you kill Hitler? Do you send a trolley down this track or down that track? I mean, all of those sorts of questions that we often think of as ethical questions always left me a bit cold, because I always wanted to ask, well, what happened just before that? Or what happened the day before, the week before? How did you get in that situation in the first place? That's the really interesting ethical question for me.
So then, considering your point of view on ethics, what has ethics been a large part of your studies at all, or has it just been kind of something that's just there for
Yeah,
you?
weirdly, I wouldn't have expected it, but yeah, it actually has. And the reason I say I wouldn't have expected it is what I said before. It's like, in grad school, I was pretty turned off with ethics. I was, I really thought that this is leaving me cold. This is not connecting with the world. And then the more I understood about what I actually cared about, the more I realized it was a deeply ethical concern. And so, I'm interested in, I do a lot of work in African philosophy, and I'm interested in what ethics looks like within the space of African culture, both contemporary and traditional cultures, and how that lines up with or doesn't line up with the ways that we've talked about it in the West. One of those vectors, or one of those interesting kind of features, is the kind of deep commitment that you often see in Africa to a kind of communal sort of way of thinking about the world. In other words, it's often summarized as "I am because we are." In other words, I am not just an individual first and then everything else happens after that. I cannot extract myself. I cannot take myself out of the community in which I find myself and the history which brought me into being and all the rest of it. And so if that's the case, ethics looks differently to me, it seems. Often our Western ethics has started from that individualist perspective and said, how do I as an individual make a good decision? And anything else is not really my issue. You're an individual and you make your decisions. But if you start thinking about it in terms of community, then it becomes a question of conversation, of heritage, of shared goals. A lot of different questions come to bear then that are, I think, much more like how we actually live in this world, rather than some kind of abstract sort of thing. So yeah, for me, ethics has, to my surprise, been pretty important for what I do.
Awesome. That's awesome. So going back to your study on African philosophy,
Mhm.
could you expand on your recent work in the book African Philosophy in an Activist Cognition, the Space of Thought?
Right. So, especially as it, connects to ethics, what I wanted to do in that book was to move the discussion of philosophy away from how we've often thought about it in terms of getting our concepts straight. Okay, so in other words, we've often thought about philosophy as getting a kind of a suite of concepts in our minds, maybe a full theory or something like that. And once we have that, then we can act in the world. Then our concepts drive our action in the world. And in activism, which is an area of cognitive science, it kind of pushes back against certain ways that we've thought about how cognition works. So the kind of dominant theory of cognition is what we call computationalism. And what that means is that, our brains are like computers. We have hardware and software, and the idea is to get our software running properly. And then once we have those concepts, they enable us to do what we do in the world. And of course, that is actually true in some cases, but I don't think it's a complete explanation for how we act in the world. We are bodies in the world. We are physical beings in the world. We we extend ourselves into our technology. We all have smartphones now, and so we outsource some of what we think and what we are. We and we are inactive, which what that means is that we don't just simply think first and then act later. Sometimes the acting brings our thoughts into being. And so it's a two-way street. It's not a one-way street. And so for me, much of African philosophy has conceived of philosophy in the kind of computationalist manner. In other words, the goal is to figure out how Africans philosophize about African existence. And that is an important job that ought to be done. That's great, but it's not complete. And it's not complete because African philosophy itself starts from this very embodied sort of position. We are already in the world. We can't abstract from that. And so how does that change how we do philosophy? And so that entire book really is about looking at some specific examples of important texts that, if you're learning African philosophy, these might be texts that show up in your intro course or something like that. And what I try and do is just do an entirely different reading of those texts to show that it's not that we bring this new perspective to Africa. It was already there. It was already there. We just didn't read for it. And so what was already there is this notion that there's another side to philosophy, and it's been there all along, both in Africa and actually in the West, but we tend to ignore it. And that is, what resources do we have to live well in this world? So not just how do we get our concepts straight, but how do we live well in a world where we don't know the future, where we can't know the future, where we live in a complex space in which no matter how much we try, it's going to surprise us. And so we can't plan, 10 years or 100 years or whatever in advance. What we can do is figure out how to live well on a moment by moment basis. We live, we look at what happened, we revise, we do it again, we go back and forth like that. And so for me, that is an entirely different way of conceiving philosophy, but also conceiving ethics, actually, right? It's not just about putting principles in place, these abstract principles, you should do this, and then it just lives throughout time. It's rather about having an ethics that's very much grounded in living in the world and figuring out how is it that you can work with incomplete information. You can work with people who get things wrong a lot and institutions that get things wrong a lot. This issue of place does bind things together. And so, I work in digital humanities as well. And, I'm interested in the questions of ethics within that space too. And in a certain sense, it's no different from what I described for African philosophy, right? I mean, ethics has to be in some way grounded and oriented towards flourishing. That looks a little bit weird in the context of everything being digital and everything being virtual. And so I've written about that as well. What does it look like to live in virtual space? And so I've tried to work out a theory of play, for example, what it means to play, not just play games, not just first person shooter games, but to play in a manner that allows us to become what we are not yet. And so, like I say, ethics turned out to be a much larger part of what I do than I ever thought it would be. It just seems to pop up everywhere once you start thinking about how can philosophy lead us into that space of what it means to live well in this world.
Right. That's awesome. Everything you said was great, and I am so thankful that you were here today for this interview.
Well, thank you
And
for calling me up.
of course.